Welcome to the Archway of Hope podcast. My name is Chip Wilson, and I will be your host, where we cover things from loss, grief, and providing hope for those who have lost someone too early. Welcome again to another episode of our Archway of Hope podcast. With me is Paul and Christy Donaldson, and we're going to talk about some interesting subjects today, hopefully. And today's subject title that we're going to talk about is grief in a complicated relationship. And meaning, you lose someone too early, perhaps, that maybe the relationship was strained ahead of time. Maybe it's always been strained. Maybe it's one of those situations where it was a relationship that had multiple layers to it. I don't know. But Christy, when you have people come into your practice, do you get that a lot, or is it common to see kind of confusing relationships and the people that are grieving and don't know why they're grieving or feel guilty for grieving?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and in fact, this week alone, I had one professional situation like that and one personal, friend that had a situation like that. And I started thinking, this is a really important and relevant area of grief that I'm just not sure it's really been tapped into very much. And so I think that it's worth discussing. And that is, when I say complicated grief, it could be a myriad of things, right? But mainly what I'm thinking about is when you have a relationship and you lose somebody way too soon, and maybe the relationship wasn't what you ever wanted it to be, or wasn't what you needed it to be at the time of death. And so, what is that? It could be a whole bunch of things, right? And so, maybe it's a parent that you were estranged from, or a child that you were estranged from. A lot of times I see this coupled with either traumatic experiences, like in the past, prior to the traumatic experience of losing somebody too soon, but or addiction in a person, or something that they're battling with, or mental health issues that they're battling with, and then it starts to push people away from them. I was having a conversation with somebody this morning, in fact, that was a personal relationship with me, and they said I could share this part, but they were saying that a friend had messaged them and said just the right thing to them, and I said, what was that? And they said, I know your relationship was complicated with that person that you lost, but you loved them and they loved you, and it's okay to grieve that.
Yeah.
And I thought, what a beautiful, way and tribute to the person's grief process, right? Giving them right to be able to express it and feel it and grieve it, even if in the past they had talked about how frustrating it was to be in a relationship with that person, or how many things they had done for that person, and it seemed lost on them. And now they're gone, And this person actually said to me this morning, I felt peace when I asked for a toxicology report, and they were clean at the time of death. It had nothing to do with the battle that we had been pushing into for so long, which made them feel some kind of closure on that they had actually made a difference in this person's life, managing, taking over all of their accounts recently and being fiduciary, responsible party in that, and then also managing medical care with that as well, and making sure that they were being honest about their addiction process. And now that person, even though they're gone, this person is left behind just sad and, devastated that they finally got this person in line and now they're gone. And it would have been the same way, though, if they had still been using and they had lost them. It would have been that grief of what could have been, what wasn't, what shoulda, coulda, woulda happened if I had done this. There's all of these feelings that arise in complicated grief patterns like that.
So do you find that if there isn't a reconciliation before the person passes away, say, for example, two siblings, for example, that fought most of their life, one of the siblings passes away. The other one's like, we haven't talked in years because of multiple reasons, whatever it might be. But I'm feeling this sense of loss for my sibling who passed away, or friend, or whatever. And there was never any closure. I feel the loss, and now I feel bad because there wasn't closure. Or do you run into that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, this goes back to one of the topics we talked about before, which is, when people say ridiculous things to a person in grief, right? So this is that time when somebody says, why are you even bothered by this? You hated your brother, sister, mother, father,
Right.
grandparent, whatever it is, right? Friend. You hated them. Why are you having a problem with this? That would be one of those times when you just have to understand that people are not going to get your grief and you're still entitled to it.
Sure.
Right? And that it's okay to feel a whole host of emotions and feelings to it. And honestly, I would like to say that sometimes it's harder to grieve complicated grief and complicated relationships, compared to the ones where you had this solid relationship. You had a lot of time with them. You got to experience daily life to the fullest, and so you have all these incredible memories, which is different from the person that had this intense relationship that they were constantly in battle or constantly having to go to bat for, or always in protection mode, or fear of losing them for 15, 20, 30, 40 years until it did happen. That big fear that they had of losing them because of whatever that complication was.
Yeah. Right. So if someone comes to you that's in a complicated relationship that someone they cared about, even though they hadn't talked to in a long time or had problems with, passed away, how do you deal with that differently than somebody who lost someone they were extremely close to?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most important things is to give time for a person to talk about their story. It's so important that people can express exactly whatever that narrative is in their head. And you always have to remember it's the perspective of that person, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's one-sided. It doesn't matter if this is the only way that they have been able to see this. What matters is that they have time to fully express it and feel it, and not feel compromised by other people's opinions or judgments or reminders of a broken relationship. None of that all goes to the wayside when somebody is hurting and sad that they lost somebody. The main focus has to be that they're missing that person. They're missing whatever it was, what it should have been, what they wanted it to be, what their dreams were for that relationship, and what they never were able to get out of that relationship.
So I was wondering, when you, and to kind of expound on that, do you find that they're not only grieving the person that they lost, which they had a complicated relationship with, but they're grieving what they always wanted that didn't happen, or what they didn't have. Mm-hmm. And so they're grieving something that, and from this point on, they're not going to have the opportunity to find redemption in that relationship. Mm-hmm. Do you find that they're grieving that as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, we all have hopes and dreams and aspirations, and most of us, human beings are designed for connection. We're designed for relationships, right? That's what we're meant to do. And so when you aren't given that opportunity, or when it's taken from you too soon, and you don't even have time to wrap your brain around it, much less be able to fix whatever it was that was still lingering there. How about the sibling set that were the closest growing up, and they have a disagreement and they haven't talked in a year, but they were the best of friends growing up as siblings. Now they haven't talked in a year, and then they lose their sibling. All of that uncharted territory, all that space that should have had something, talked about, discussed, could have been better. We probably have all been in a relationship like that where we can think about, oh my gosh, if I hadn't had time to repair that. My own sister and I had a hot moment like that, when we were in our adult world and we were still fishing through some things that we didn't even know were kind of there, for so many years. And if something had happened to one of us in that time period that we were kind of estranged before we came back together and were able to heal and talk about things, we would have missed out on something that it now is just incredibly relational and connected and important to both of us, you know? And the things that happened during that time were not true to what our relationship was. It was a moment in time. And thankfully, we didn't lose each other in that time, or it would have been something very similar to this, right? It was already hard enough during that time. And neither of us was right or wrong. It just was a thing. And so that's hard, you know, and how do you talk about that? How do you say, this person meant the world to me, and the people around you are going, no, they didn't. You didn't even want to talk to them the past year. What are you talking about, right? And so in your mind, it's complicated and conflicting because you're like, no, but we were something. That person was important to me. How about the ex-spouse? You loved that person. You were with that person for however long you were with them. And during that time period, it was important to you. And now they're gone, and maybe they have a new family, or you have a new family, or maybe you don't. And you're grieving the loss of that person, or the fact that your children with that person possibly, or your fur babies, you know, your animals with that person were important and still are important, and that person's gone, but yet you kind of don't have the right, you know, I say that in quotes, the right to grieve that person because of whatever happened in that relationship that had disillusion, you know, meant to it. And so now all of a sudden you're not really, by societal norms, supposed to have the right to grieve that. Well, that's antithetical to what we're supposed to be able to do in our grief, right? You should be able to grieve it no matter what. And if you don't, then you're pushing down and repressing the real feelings and the things. And eventually that garbage has to come out, right? Like, we can't press it down forever and never be able to experience it and talk about it and work through it. So
when people come into your office and they're experiencing this, what are kind of the first steps? What do you take them through to help them kind of reconcile this? I have grief with someone who is estranged, or we had a problem with, whatever the case might be. Do you approach that differently than you would somebody who came in that's grief-stricken and they had a relationship, a very close relationship? Do you take a different path, or?
Well, and I think, you know, this is another thing, and we have kind of touched on this before, but you have to understand what the background is in that relationship, right? You have to also know, like here, we talk about losing somebody way too soon, right? So that's going to look a little bit different in the type of therapeutic response that I'm going to have than a person that comes in and maybe they knew the person was going to pass, or it wasn't as surprising to them or something like that. I'm going to look at that a little bit differently. A person that had a traumatic event, like some of the ones that we've been talking to here, I'm going to use prolonged exposure therapy with them. We are going to pull out every single nuance of their memories leading up to that day and through it.
Prolonged exposure therapy. What is that? Define that for me.
It's one of the recommended practices along with EMDR for trauma and like releasing all of the hard spots of that traumatic exposure that you've experienced. But it's about 18 weeks in all, and there's many parts to it, but the kind of the easiest way of speaking to it is that you're basically telling your story, and you're recognizing the somatic experiencing that you're having as you're talking about that traumatic memory. And while you go through it, you're stopping and pausing and speaking into those spaces. Like right now, I can feel my shoulders tensing as I'm talking about that moment right before the news came to me or the thing happened, or whatever that is. And it can be used in for the person themselves that have survived, you know, something traumatic. And it can be, you know, for the people that are left behind after a traumatic episode. And then they record it and they listen to it as homework. And during the listening, they will try to extrapolate any extra memories that come to them from that, because when we're repressing things, or that part of our memory that is kind of shut down whenever something traumatic happens, almost to protect us, we will push away some of the things that need to also be brought forth. And so through the process of noticing what your body's experiencing and giving merit to the real physical or physiological responses that our body has during stress, and by being able to talk about the narrative, and in a very safe environment, where when we can see that their anxiety is amping, we can pause it and, let them recognize in their body where they're feeling that and calm it down and do it in a very therapeutic way, to not re-traumatize them through the process, then they can heal more thoroughly, right? And meanwhile, all of those little tiny memories that have been like unconsciously pushed away, they can start bringing those forward too. They might journal through it while they're listening. They may draw a picture while they're doing it that comes to mind. But what I have seen over the past, 12, 15 years of using this is that people are able to, by the 10th, 14th, 16th, 18th session, they're able to pull pieces out, and I'll see it like a light bulb come on. They'll be like, oh, I had forgotten about that. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that I didn't remember that had happened, and I can see that as soon as even 8 to 10 sessions sometimes, just depending on how willing the person is and if they'll do the nightly homework with it. And then along with it, to make it safe, I also give them other strategies to use to calm their body, before or after or both. And so anyways, it's a very nurturing way of being able to really pull out all of the pieces of that trauma.
Wow. Do you ever work with people that were deeply hurt by the person they lost and maybe had not even had a relationship for a long time with that person, and they were just really confused trying to put the pieces together? They didn't even really know they were grieving that person, but that's what's going on in the background. Mm-hmm. And if so, how do you work with those people?
Yeah, that's a great question, because this week alone, I had somebody that we were in the middle of like a couples session, and they started, really crying and said, I don't know why I'm even crying about this, as I'm telling you that, my bio father passed 2 weeks ago, since the last time that we were here. And I said, well, why are you confused about crying over that? That seems like a natural thing to me. And you are always welcome to have that emotion in here. And they said, because I never even met him. And I said, well, tell me about that, right? I want to know about that. It's those moments when you realize that because the relationship was supposed to be that of a father and a daughter, and the father could never be what he needed to be for that daughter who was so desperately seeking it and waiting for it. This is the next statement that I always hear, but my so-and-so was able to fill in that void. But think about that. They're lamenting over that relationship that they never even met, or maybe was very, lacking in what they needed it to be. And they're saying, I don't know why I'm feeling this way, but I'm feeling it in a big way. And also, but this person was able to fill in the void. Well, obviously, you never fill in the void of that biological component to you that you felt like you really needed. I even see that in my child that I adopted. She brings up topics like that too, where she needs to fill in the gaps in her memory. And those areas, you risk even confabulation when you start to fill in areas of void with contrived information that is maybe not a true depiction of what happened. You just start filling it in because it's almost like a pothole. When you're driving down the road and there's a pothole, and then the next time you drive down the road, you see that they've poured a bunch of gravel in it and pounded it down, and still yet it's not great, right? Then one day you pass by and they've filled it and they've asphalted it and it's smooth. that's kind of what I think happens in therapy when we actually are able to expose those raw places and be very vulnerable and real about how we're really feeling about that. And so therapeutically, I would be saying, okay, now tell me how you really feel about that. Like, let's go there when you're ready, and if today's not the day, then when it is, let's go there. And if when you leave here, you have a memory burst or a flashbulb memory, as we call it, write it down, pull it out as much as you can. Give me something on that piece of paper or that journal, or audio, record yourself talking about it or something, so that you can continue pulling from it. And then when you come in next time, then we'll visit that again. And that way you don't, how something happens and you're like, I don't even know why I just thought about that or I felt that. In the middle of the night, I'll write things down on a piece of paper. I learned that from Martha Stewart a long time ago, that she would have these creative ideas, and she always had a pad of paper next to her bed, because when she woke up, she wanted to remember it the next day. And sometimes it even looks like sleepy writing, right? But you wake up and you're like, oh yeah, I forgot I had that, right? Well, that's kind of the same thing here. It comes out and you're like, you're driving down the road, right? And you're like, I don't even know why I just had this memory of this loved one. Or this feeling that I just had. Why am I even having that? I haven't even met this person, and yet I'm grieving it so hard, right? So you immediately will record it, do something, write it down, and then I hope that in a professional therapeutic relationship, you're able to go into that place in a very kind, supportive manner, right? Yeah.
So I think you answered it in a way that helped, but I'm still looking for some clarity on if somebody comes to you and says, I don't know why I'm upset of loss. Somebody I was estranged to, I didn't think I really cared about, but now all of a sudden they're gone. I'm never going to be able to have them in my life again, even though I haven't had them in my life for a long time on purpose. I feel this sense of loss. Do you approach that person differently than someone who loses someone very close to them?
I would hope that in that situation that I'm able to provide an opportunity for them to do and say whatever they need to say, regardless how meaningful that relationship was to them, because a relationship is a relationship at the end of the day, right? It's either something that you wanted more of, something that you needed to see in a different way, something that you never had but you wanted. It's still a loss.
What if they're angry at them? Like, I was angry at them because they didn't apologize, or they hurt me in some way, and that's why we've been estranged for this period of time, whatever it is, and now they're gone forever. I'll never get that apology that's owed to me, or I'll never, we never came to closure on it because they were being stubborn or they were the issue. And so the anger is there, and it's more about not feeling lost, but feeling angry at them, because how dare they leave this earth without, apologizing to me.
Right. Well, I'm not going to tell them to not feel that way. I mean, I'm not here to, as a therapist, I'm not here to judge your responses.
Right.
I'm here to guide you through them. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to feel that anger and to talk about it and, express that anger. And then we're also going to talk about what underlies that feeling of anger. Sure. Typically what I find is that fear is the root of all the other emotions. What is your fear? What is your real fear in that? Was it a fear of not ever getting to finish that conversation? Is it a fear of, somebody dying before you got to tell them that you really did love them through all that? What is that fear?
Yeah.
Is it a fear of, what other people think about that relationship, or how others are going to judge you in that relationship? There's a lot of different ways that people, could answer that. And I'm not going to pretend that I know all of them. I'm just going to be with them. That's my role. And so, and I kind of want to turn that around to y'all. If you were in that predicament, if you were in that situation, what would you want from a therapist? What would you want that conversation to look like?
Yeah. I heard a quote a long time ago, and I don't know it word for word, but basically it's the stories that we tell about our past kind of frame up the way we see ourselves today. So the stories that we tell about ourselves over and over and over again become our reality. And so sometimes we have to think about, are we telling the story the way it actually happened? Or are we telling the story the way we think it happened? We remember that it happened? Or have we created our own version of the past, our own story of the past, which frames up what we're trying to figure out today? And we have to go back and figure out, okay, am I telling the story correctly? Or am I just telling my side of it?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and I had something this week too as well, where a person had been corporately downsized and were grieving in a big way over that. That's not the same thing, but remember we talked about grief can look a lot of different ways.
Sure.
And in nature of this discussion, this would be a complicated kind of grief as well. Because it did not come from the peers that they were with day in and day out. It came from a national kind of situation. But their statement was, I'm like old and washed up now. What do I even have to offer? I'm downsized because I'm in the 50 plus club, and they can find younger, people that maybe they can even hire for, less dollars and whatever. But my expertise, my wisdom, my knowledge in this field, you can't buy that. There's not enough of that. But what do I do now? Sure. Like, who's going to want to come to this person who is this age and, whatever. And I said, well, as long as you have that narrative that you're telling yourself, that's exactly where you're going to be, So one of the things that I always, harp on is that what we see with our eyes, what we hear with our ears, what we speak with our mouth, our brain is creating a pathway, right. And that narrative is going to continue to play out. You have to, and this is more of like a positive psychology concept, you have to tell yourself the things you want to believe and the things you want to demonstrate in your life. Mm-hmm. If we tell ourselves that we're a terrible human, we're going to not only act upon terrible features, but we're also going to believe that about ourselves, right? Yeah. I'm not worth it. I'm a terrible person. I'll never be enough. But if you take that, just like that situation there, what I said is, you've got to take that and say, no, I know that I know what I'm talking about. I know that I am an expert in this field, and I know that I still have things to offer. Yeah. Right? You have to turn it into the language that really is meaningful and will propel you forward, not backwards. And, my other big thing I always say is that, anything that is from the past breeds depression, and anything that is futuristic breeds anxiety. So we want to bring people back to the here and now. What do you feel right now? What does this, feel like here, right here? What do you notice about your body? What do you notice about the feelings, the thoughts, the cognitions that you're having right now? What is that fear right now? Not futuristically, not from the past. We can't do anything about that, and we don't know about the future. You may be worried about this, and in an hour, your time is gone too. I mean, really. Sure. So we can't get too far into all of that. We have to stay right here and rooted in the present. Right.
But as you mentioned earlier, fear is the most powerful driver of behavior. So if fear is our justification of why we can't move forward, or fear is, got us to a point where we're just stuck. It's how do you get over that? How do you work through that fear? And I can see how someone in their 50s who gets downsized starts creating a narrative in their mind. I'm very valuable, but who's going to want me? Yeah. It's fear driven. It's all fear driven. It's not value driven. It's not optimism driven. It's fear driven. Yeah, which is natural. I mean, I don't think that's a situation that doesn't happen to everybody. They have a sense of fear in the very beginning, like, what's next? What am I going to do? But
and you have to give them time to go through that shock and grief of loss, right? And then you have to move forward with positive wording, positive thinking, positive affirmations to self, which is super hard to do.
Oh, yeah.
When you're in disparity, you know? Yeah.
Well, in response to your question earlier about what would my expectations be if I found myself in a place of grieving, whether it was complicated or not, I think that I would want, and I'm sure this is very common, I would want first to be just for you to hear me out, to tell my story, to be heard from start to finish. everybody wants to be understood. Everybody wants the world, or at least some people in the world, to understand their story, hear their story. And then after that, tying in with Archway's, mission, I would want somehow through our conversations, through your questions to me, I would want some kind of hope, something to hang on to that, I am going to make it through this, or this is going to be better, or I'm going to be better at some point. Just something to hang my hat on, because when you're in a place of deep grief, which I have not been in a place like that based on, the kinds of people that we're dealing with and working with and trying to help. I haven't been in that place of deep grief, but I would imagine that I would just want something to hang on to. And I know that's a long process, but I would imagine after people are able to tell their story and you begin really working with them on a professional level, that they start to see little hints that, there's other people that are walking this path. I'm on it now. And if they've made it, I think there's a chance I can make it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. And, when you look at like, how do you process grief, or, what can I expect from joining a group about grief or things like that? The one thing that the leader is able to provide are resources, right? Which is exactly what we're trying to do here, is provide resources. And you want to be open and able to listen. You want to make sure that everybody in that group has an opportunity to express themselves, and it's not commandeered by only one person's story or one person's grief, which can happen sometimes when somebody comes in and they have a fresher, grieving situation than another person and things like that. But mainly, the main thing is to be open and willing to hear them and to allow them to express it in all the areas, that they might feel and when they feel it. And remember, we talked about the stages of grief not being linear, that you can bounce all over the place. So they may come in and act like they've accepted it, and then, a week later be angry or, depressed or, bargaining, like, well, maybe if I do this, this will happen, or, I can get this back. And, obviously we know that that's not the case. So being able to hear somebody is the very main thing, and allowing them just to know that that their story is appreciated in their own perspective. Right. It doesn't have to be made up to fit any other piece of that puzzle other than how they're feeling right now and what that experience was. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And accepting it.
Is acceptance kind of phase one? I mean, if somebody comes in and they tell their story and they're very thorough and pour their heart out and tell you all the different emotions, whether it's 1 session, 5 sessions, 10 sessions, however long it takes, is our goal to get to a point where we accept reality as a reality and then we can move on past that? Or is there a step or two prior to that needs to be, to me, acceptance of reality is, I would assume, would be the first step.
That's interesting that you say that. When you think about our previous knowledge of like the grieving process, acceptance in the past would have been like the end result, right? Mm-hmm. So you would have had to go through, denial and all these other anger and bargaining and depression, and you would have to go through all of these processes before you would get to acceptance, right? But now we know that it doesn't go in a line. Sure. It's not chronological order, and it doesn't fit a certain mold. It's all over the place. So that would not go in line with what I've just said right there, right? That somebody would have to be at acceptance to move forward. I think grief is messy. I think it's very messy, and it's kind of like walking into a room that you did not create the mess in and having to clean it up. You're like, wait a minute, I didn't choose this. What in the world? I didn't spill that milk right there. I don't want to clean it up, and everybody's kind of like going, I'm not cleaning up, and that's kind of what our mind does too, right? I don't want to deal with this. Yes, you do. You have to deal with it. No, I don't want to, and you're kind of inside your brain pushing away from it and kind of repressing all of the things that might make you feel it. I think the first step is just acknowledging that you're hurting. That's the very first step. The moment that you can say, I'm hurting and I cannot tackle this by myself, and you walk in, which is very vulnerable.
Yeah.
Because everybody's grief process is their own. It's so individualized, right? It's like a fingerprint. And everybody feels it differently, and everybody's background and history and the relationship and all of that can bring a whole new dynamic to it. So there's no perfect cookie cutter way of grieving or feeling whatever you're feeling. So the first step is being vulnerable and allowing yourself to accept help. And then that help should look like whatever you're needing it to look like. It needs to be specialized to you and your circumstance, and talking about exactly how you feel about that and working through it in your own timeline.
So not to use semantics, but when I say accepting, step one might be accepting that I can't do it myself, and saying that I need help, accepting that I'm angry and upset and others don't think I should be, but you know what? I accept the fact that I am, even if others don't. I accept the fact that it's not my mess, that I've been thrown into this, but I do have to do the work to clean it up, whether I want to or not. To me, it's a whole bunch of little bitty accepting reality along the way, accepting the fact that I'm angry, accepting the fact that I'm sad, accepting the fact that I cannot handle my emotions at times when I think I should, accepting the fact that I'm grieving even though it doesn't make sense to others. It's a whole bunch of being real with yourself, I guess, and saying, I have to deal with this. I can't just forget about it, pretend like it didn't happen, or lash out at others.
Well, it's got to be hard too. It's got to be hard when you're walking a path and all your friend groups don't understand it. They don't understand how messy it is. I mean, they rub up against it because they're with you and they're walking this journey with you, but there's no way they can understand how messy grief is. We're shooting a documentary right now, and the subject of that documentary had a friend come up a year later. Well, have you gotten over it yet? One of the things you don't say.
Yeah.
And that's probably how a lot of us look at it who have friends that are grieving a deep, tragic loss is, well, I wonder if they moved through it yet and gotten through the grieving process. But, as you've talked about, that grieving process, and milestones come up. Today is Red Herring's birthday. And so Jimmy and Lorna have to revisit some of that pain, and another milestone has come, another year has passed. And so to the rest of the world, it's, okay, have you gotten over it yet? And to the griever, it's, no, this comes and goes at different times for different reasons.
Yeah, and you never, ever get to detach yourself from it.
Right.
It comes up in other ways. As you were talking, I was thinking, what if we took out the word acceptance in that way and we use the word recognize?
Okay.
Recognize that I need help, recognize that I'm angry, recognize that I'm feeling all these things, because recognition and acceptance are two different things.
You're right. So they recognize it even if they haven't accepted it yet.
Yeah.
They at least recognize.
Yeah, well, look at the Herrings as you brought up. I mean, do they accept that they never get to have another birthday, in person with this child that they love so much? I don't think you ever accept that. I would rebuke that all day long.
Right.
Forget that.
Right.
Forget all of the people that think I should be accepting this. I don't accept it. I never will accept it. I recognize that I don't get this, but I do not accept it because I did not want it. What I want is that child with me, or that loved one with me, and I want to be selfish.
Yeah.
I'm flesh, and I'm selfish and, all the things, right? So I want that person, so I do not accept it, but I do recognize that this is something that I've been dealt. In life, this is the hand I've been dealt, and I have to do something with it, whatever that is. So.
Can you, again, I guess we don't know the answer to this, but can you fully heal without acceptance?
I would hope so, that you can heal in that time and space that you're in right then.
Yeah.
It might look different 5 years later, 10 years later, a lifetime later. It might look different how you feel about that, but that you can get there. Maybe not to the point where you finally say, okay, I'm over this now. I don't think you ever get over it, but I think it does start to morph and look different with, therapeutic resolve and time and, an opportunity to be accepted right where you are. That would be the acceptance that I would be looking for.
Sure.
And maybe you do accept this is the situation I'm in, but you'll never accept this is the way things are supposed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, would you want to accept that?
No. And I'm sitting here thinking about things in my own life. I'm sure we all do, things that, I should have accepted by now, but I just can't. But I do recognize, but I don't accept them because I don't think they're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it doesn't affect my day to day like it used to.
Because you recognize it, you've given time and energy to whatever healing process that you have had with that, and you've moved forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Good stuff.
Yeah. Well, this was a good subject title. So I know hopefully you're listening to this, you got some value out of it, and we're excited about our next episode.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. You can like and share, would be awesome. Visit us at our website, archwayofhope.org. We're on all social channels. You can follow us there. Our intent is to share solid information with people that are needing to hear this information and provide hope for those who have lost someone too early.